In ancient times, they called Kabbalah mysticism. But if you tried to explain the computer just even 200 years ago, or the fax machine or the internet, they'd call it mysticism. So Kabbalah spoke about concepts that were literally not just centuries, but even millennia ahead of time. So for example, the Zohar, 2,000 years ago, which is 1,500 years before Columbus, the Zohar spoke about a round earth. To quote, "The whole world rolls around like a ball, so that some people are above and some are below." The Zohar said 2,000 years ago that true reality exists in 10 dimensions. Can you imagine? We just learned about dimensions in this century, that there's other dimensions we can't see. So Kabbalah said true reality exists actually in 10 dimensions. Now, why is that important? They said, if you look around with your 5 senses, we only detect 1% of true reality. The remaining 99% is hidden, says Kabbalah, in these other dimensions.
Please, could you stay a while to share my grief? For it's such a lovely day to have to always feel this way. And the time that I will suffer less is when I never have to wake. Wandering stars, for whom it is reserved, the blackness of darkness forever. Wandering stars, for whom it is preserved, the blackness of darkness forever. Those who have seen the needless sign of dread, like a husk from which all that was now has fled, and the masks that the monsters wear to feed upon their prey. Wandering stars, for whom it is reserved, the blackness of darkness forever. Wandering stars, for whom it is preserved, the blackness of darkness forever. Always doubled up inside. Take a while to shed my grief. Always doubled up inside. Daunted, cruel.
That song is a version of Wandering Star by Portishead, back from the 90s. It's a great song, but it's actually quoting from the book of Jude, as I'm sure some of you recognize. Jude being really the only specific mention of what today we call planets anywhere in the Bible. I believe there is one other reference in the Old Testament, which certain translations render planet, but honestly it's a lot more ambiguous as to whether that's a correct translation or not. But in Jude, Wandering Star is undeniably, referring to, that's what the ancients all the ancient peoples called the planets. And the context of that verse is extremely interesting because, of course, in verse 13 of Jude chapter 1, he's talking about ungodly men who've rejected authority and followed the way of Cain. And he makes a number of poetic descriptions, one of which is they are wandering stars for whom the blackest darkness has been reserved forever. So he's making an external reference, directly linking the wandering stars with judgment. And it's made that much more interesting being in the book of Jude, which is quotes from the book of Enoch and connects to what it says about the luminaries that did not hold to their assigned paths and the judgment that was given to them. But why am I talking about all this? In the past, I've touched upon this in the sense that in Genesis, when it's on day 4, when the luminaries are created, it only mentions, of course, the sun, moon, and stars, and those are 3 distinct creations. The sun is clearly not one of the stars, and this is not observational language or whatever kinds of hermeneutic contrivances people want to come up with. There are 3 distinct categories. And of course, the planets is not a part of that. They're simply stars, sun, moon, and stars. But what's also noteworthy is that it's just the term or mention of planets missing in the original creation, but this whole concept of a planetary system, a solar system, is nowhere found in the Bible. I mean, in the book of Job, it does reference the constellations, and the constellations having names, and so by that we can infer that the constellations were actually a part of the original design. But the idea of these wandering stars being part of the design and comprising this very complex system is never so much as hinted at, and that becomes increasingly significant when you turn and then look into the realm of the occult and mysticism and things like the Kabale, because it starts to become very interesting that the planets long before Galileo or Copernicus or any of the modern conceptions of a solar system were around, the planets were, centuries before any of that came about, were regarded as being part of a system. And like that guy, I think his name is Billy Phillips, he's a Kabbalist teacher, he says that there are 10 dimensions, and so when you start to explore how the Kabbalistic tree of life is essentially one of the things it's supposedly representing is these 10 spheres, and these 10, they correspond to the planets, and they're also dimensions, and they correspond to chakras in the body supposedly, and on, and it's also this system of gods. It is the pantheon of gods which appear in every pagan mythology, every pagan pantheon in some form or another, and there's endless variations depending on the Chinese system or the Babylonian system or the Egyptian system or the Norse mythologies, the Aztec and the Maya, all these slightly different deities, slightly different, but they all incorporate the planets. And the more you delve into this, the more you see how central it is to all occult cosmologies, all occult belief systems. While the only reference in the Bible is really this one in Jude, and it is one associated with judgment and rebellion and the fallen angels. And I've actually been listening to a number of lectures given by Manly P. Hall, the famed occultist. He talks a lot about the solar system and the planetary bodies, and the ancient connection to the ancient gods and Kabbalah and everything. He knew all the different. Manly P. Hall was, in many ways, was the original progenitor of astrotheology in the 20th century, combining Gnosticism and all the different occult traditions and shamanic traditions. And basically what Manly P. Hall explains is that according to the ancients, and by ancients he means, the ancient pagan mystery schools, understanding the planets, the pantheon, as a system, the significance is that it very much does function like a ladder.
The universe was not strange. It was nije. It was not terrible. It was tremendous, but not fear-inspiring. It was vast, but this very vastness challenged man to grow rather than to surround him with fear. And so enlightened peoples began to reach out in friendliness to the stars. They did not populate the firmament with evil beings, but with great good powers. And they sensed these good powers as forever protective and paternal. They sensed these powers as contributing continuously to the well-being of every creature that existed. And by the time Egyptian civilization had arisen, we see this universe in which we live strangely charted, mysteriously organized into planes and levels and spheres and departments. There were worlds within worlds, wheels within wheels, as in the story of Ezekiel's vision. Man saw the universe as a vast structure of evolving life and saw himself moving through this structure.
You know, according to any form of Luciferianism, there's no such thing as sin. There's no such thing as a rebellion against God. It was simply some kind of a choice that was made back in the distant past to go on this journey of discovery, this journey of enlightenment. And so man left his original abode in the stars, living with the gods, and came down to the mortal existence that we now have. And he came down through these planetary levels, these dimensions, these spheres. And so the ultimate goal is to eventually ascend back up through them and go back to where we came from, to return to the stars. And this is what is so interesting once you really start to kind of look at just materialistic Copernican cosmology and what it says, how in so many ways it does seem to be actually preserving these old pagan mythological concepts in a materialistic form in some way or another, in the sense of, you know, we're all star stuff, we came from the stars, you know, there's a materialistic embodiment of that. And then conversely, by going back up through the stars, by spreading out and conquering the solar system, you can even think of the planets as being these like stepping stones, these stages of, you know, exploring the cosmos. And it is pretty uncanny how it still mirrors so much of the underlying concepts. And the more I really think about this, the more it makes sense in the way that that's really all that Satan cares about in the end, is the embedded teaching within this false belief system versus that false belief system. He doesn't really care whether someone is deceived by atheism or materialism, scientific materialism, or if they're, you know, full-blown occultic mysticism, you know, or whatever combination between. It's all, the net effect is the same. And that's why it's pretty amazing the more you study about Copernican cosmology, where you can see these parallels and how, with all the changes, it's still, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, I think about the analogy of, you know, it doesn't matter, like Satan doesn't care if, you know, if you prefer Harry Potter, you know, or if you prefer Star Wars. Either way, it's the same witchcraft, it's the same Gnostic worldview being preached. You know, he doesn't care, you know, whether you like wands or you like lightsabers. You know, it's all the same. You know, it makes no difference in the end. And again, going back to the quote at the beginning, when he's quoting from the Zohar was written in the 13th century, talking about Earth, the Earth rolls, and there's people on top of it and people on the bottom of it. The Bible never says anything like that. And yet in the Zohar, which when you really boil it down, I mean, it's either a total forgery, or what I would say is almost certainly it's a demonically inspired book. It's an occult book. It's a doctrine of demons. So we see the origins of all these concepts coming from the mystery schools, coming from mysticism, coming from the occult. And it's continuing to preach the same message of ascension, of returning to the stars, of becoming like gods. That's what transhumanism is. It's the same old Luciferian message. And it's all a lie. The Bible does not teach anything resembling a planetary system, a planetary map. That's what this tree of life is. It's basically the idea. And it makes sense when the original design for the creation, the original purpose of the stars that seem to be administrated by the angelic beings, was to serve as to mark the times and seasons. That's what it says. So it was a calendar, and it was a map. That was the original intention behind the luminaries. And of course, the way Satan takes everything and perverts it and spins it and twists it into a Luciferian message, of course, that's what the luminaries have been turned into, this map towards apotheosis, a map for That's what this the Kabbalistic tree of life is it's like a diagram outlining how to navigate your way through the planetary spheres, through these dimensions of reality, turning it into a map through Satanism, which is just a labyrinth of lies and dead ends and, leading you to hell.